In the summer of 2021, when popular demonstrations broke out in Cuba, Roberto Perez Fonseca spontaneously joined in, like tens of thousands in the island. He just wanted to express his frustration for the chronic shortages of goods and medical services that affected the entire population. As happened to hundreds of Cubans, a few weeks later after the demonstrations, Perez Fonseca was accused of public disorder, incitement to commit a crime, and assaulting police officers, among other crimes, and promptly sent to prison. He then faced a summary trial in which prosecutors presented scant evidences and dubious testimonies, most of them from the regime's own security agents. 3 months later, in October 2021, Perez Fonseca was finally sentenced. 10 years in prison for the alleged crime of publicly expressing his disagreement with the communist regime.
10 years in jail for attending a peaceful protest. That's the sentence the courts handed down to Roberto Perez Fonseca, one of the hundreds that are still being tried for alleged offenses committed during demonstrations on July 11th in Cuba.
In fact, the Havana regime's answer to the protests, the largest in decades, was brutal.
They took state terrorism to the next level, intensifying repression, killing and disappearing peaceful protesters, and forcing to exile or imprisoning thousands of people.
Perez Fonseca is just one of nearly 700 individuals in Cuba who were sentenced in 2021 to long prison terms for protesting in the streets. The same regime that violently repressed peaceful citizens was elected member of the United Nations Human Rights Council at the end of 2023 for the 6th time. This is the same UN body that is supposed to help stop the violation of human rights of ordinary citizens in countries like Cuba.
I invite him to address the assembly.
And the same venue in which Ernesto Che Guevara famously declared,
Nosotros tenemos que decir aquí lo que es una verdad conocida y la hemos expresado siempre ante el mundo. Fusilamientos, sí, hemos fusilado, fusilamos y seguiremos fusilando mientras sea necesario. Nuestra lucha es una lucha a muerte.
Massive shootings and summary public trials were a part of daily life during the first decade of the Cuban Revolution. Between 1959 and 1965, thousands of so-called enemies of the revolution, most of them alleged supporters of the deposed dictator Fulgencio Batista, were arrested without warrants. They were also deprived of the right to habeas corpus and executed without benefit of a trial.
El objetivo de los fusilamientos, más que castigar al que estaba siendo acusado y iba a ser fusilado, de amenazar a los demás ciudadanos para que no se enfrentaran a la revolución.
Fidel Castro significantly enhanced the list of what he called contra-revolutionaries. He persecuted and arrested all those who could become adversaries. The list included civil leaders, artists, farmers, priests, and even homosexuals, who were perceived not to be in favor of the revolution. Castro even created forced labor camps, known as Military Production Assistance Units, or UMAP, by its Spanish acronym, in which all those perceived enemies who resisted the rule of Castro's communism were forcibly interned.
UMAP stands for Military Production Assistance Units. They took people as if from military service, but people who were on file with the police for being non-government supporters or for being homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, whatever religion they belonged to, they were sent to these camps and nobody knew exactly what these camps were like.
Inmates at UMAP were treated as camp prisoners, and many of them tortured while undergoing forced re-education processes. The less fortunate were simply executed extrajudicially. By the end of the 70s, the whole island had become a huge prison, in which leaving voluntarily wasn't an option. Many Cubans attempted unsuccessfully to seek asylum in several foreign embassies in Havana. But that changed in April of 1980, when 10,000 Cubans stormed the Peruvian embassy, desperate to find a way out of the repressive system. This led to the Mariel Exodus, in which around 125,000 Cubans abandoned Castro's oppressive paradise forever. Cubans who wanted to leave the island were subjects to acts of repudiation, a practice used by the regime to harass critics and opponents that continue until today. Trying to get out of the revolutionary inferno represented for many the risk of death. That's what happened in the summer of 1980 to almost 60 Cubans on board a boat that attempted to leave Cuba. The unfortunate episode is remembered as the Canamar River Massacre. When the boat was clearing the mouth of the Canamar River with 60 Cubans on board, it was intercepted by 2 speedboats of the Cuban Navy. The speedboats opened fire, trying to sink the boat. Some passengers were instantly killed. When the attempt to sink the boat failed, the Cuban authorities sent a military airplane to the attack. At the same time, they sent a bigger cargo ship to ram the smaller boat, which sunk in minutes. At the end of the day, more than 50 persons were killed in the attack of the Cuban forces. 14 years later, in July 1994, the horror would repeat itself in another violent massacre.
Un crimen que no tiene paralelos en la historia de Cuba.
41 people on board of the March 13th tugboat, including 20 children, lost their lives in open waters after a Cuban tugboat attacked the ship to stop it from fleeing the island.
Sencillamente lo hundieron.
They simply sank the ship. The only decision was to sink the ship, and that is the reason. A crime that has no parallel in the history of Cuba.
The testimonies of the survivors were dramatic.
My name is Sergio Perodin, survivor of the sinking of the March 13th tugboat. I lost my wife Pilar, 31 years old, and my son Yasser, 11 years old.
They broke off the tug by ramming it from the stern.
He couldn't swim and I had to sink. I was going to the bottom of the sea.
After they sank the ship, they moved away to watch us sink.
Nobody was charged for the crime. The practice of sinking boats full of Cubans looking for freedom continues. The latest attack took place in 2022 in Bahia Honda, in the northwest of Cuba. A total of 7 refugees died, including a 2-year-old girl. The rest of the 19 survivors were taken to the state security prison at Villa Marista and placed under house arrest indefinitely.
La oposición cubana se prepara para realizar algo novedoso y trascendental.
In February 1996, on the same day that a network of pro-democracy groups prepared to convene under the banner of Concilio Cubano, Cuba downed 2 light aircraft of Miami-based pro-democracy group Brothers to the Rescue over the Florida Straits. The regime simultaneously blocked dissident leaders from attending the convention and sent some of them to prison. The same fate has affected a myriad of political activists who dared to defy the totalitarian regime. In 1999, activists Marta Beatriz Roque, Felix Bon Carcases, René Gomez Manzano, and Vladimiro Roca were arrested, summarily tried, and sentenced to prison for writing a critical document titled "The Homeland Belongs to Us All" that promoted political freedoms for Cubans. In 2003, in order to stop the increasing activism of the opposition, the regime launched an unprecedented wave of arrests that sent 75 dissidents and independent journalists to prison, an event known as Cuba's Black Spring. To justify the massive detentions, the Castros used the so-called gag law, or Law 88, that established prison terms of up to 30 years for those who disseminated information the regime would consider as collaboration with the United States government.
In a police operation in the middle of the street, we were arrested.
And they almost broke my legs when it was time to frisk me.
And they gave us a summary trial, and in my case, with a prosecutor's request for 20 years, and I was sentenced to 24 years. And my life as a prisoner of conscience began.
Dissidents were not just sent to prison. Some of them lost their lives in violent and mysterious ways. Also in spring of 2003, 3 young men who hijacked a passenger ferry to try to flee to the United States were arrested and executed by a firing squad within a few days after a summary trial.
They told me, we have to wait for the case papers to go up and down the Council of State. That was Thursday afternoon. On Friday, the boys woke up dead.
Laura Poyan, the leader of the Ladies in White, a dissident group founded in 2003 and made up of the wives and female relatives of political prisoners that hold peaceful protests to demand their release, died in 2011 of a mysterious illness while hospitalized.
El Movimiento Cristiano Liberación ha mantenido siempre una línea y un espíritu pacífico.
Oswaldo Paya, the founder of Cuba's Christian Liberation Movement that opposed the one-party rule of the Cuban Communist Party and organized a petition drive known as the Varela Project, was killed in 2012 when a car he was in was run off the road by a vehicle conducted by state agents. In the same accident, human rights activist Harold Zapero, who was in the back seat with Paya, also was killed. Years earlier, Paya had anticipated the possibility of dying in a provoked car accident.
I fear for my life, because I could be shot, I could be struck by lightning, I could be passed by one of those security cars that chase me when I ride my bike on the street.
After more than a decade of investigations, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights of the Organization of American States confirmed in 2023 that both Paya and Zapero were actually victims of extrajudicial execution by Cuban government operatives.
Cuba has been elected as a member of the United Nations Human Rights Council this Tuesday.
In the last 20 years, the Cuban regime has shown neither limits nor shame when violating human rights inside and outside the island, even while being an active member of international human rights bodies.
The session at the United Nations about the plight of Cuba's political prisoners was disrupted by Cuban diplomats themselves.
On April 15, 2004, when the United Nations Human Rights Commission in Geneva decided via single vote to censure Cuba for its human rights record, a Cuban diplomat viciously attacked a human rights defender attending the session, Cuban-American activist Frank Calzon. On several occasions, as member of the UN Council on Human Rights, Cuban diplomats have defended well-known human rights violators such as China and North Korea. The Cuban regime even introduced a resolution at the Council in 2020 endorsing the end of a free Hong Kong and praising China for passing Hong Kong's repressive national security law. The regime has also refused to allow independent human rights bodies such as Amnesty International to visit the island to investigate the numerous cases of abuses that have been documented over the years. Cuba has not only blocked investigations and harassed human rights activists, artists and creators have also been targeted. That's the case of Luis Manuel Otero and Michael Elosorbo Castillo, members of the notorious San Isidro movement. In 2020, Castillo co-authored a song that praises Patria y Vida, homeland and life, the opposite of the well-known Castroist slogan, Patria o Muerte, homeland or death. The song became immensely popular in Cuba and beyond. However, The song is considered subversive by the regime. Otero and El Osorbo were sentenced to 5 and 9 years in prison respectively, just for the crime of thinking differently. Believing in God and practicing any religion, particularly Christianity, can get anyone in serious troubles in Cuba. A frequent target of the totalitarian regime have been Catholic priests and Protestant pastors since the beginning of the revolution. After seizing power in 1961, the Castro regime expelled thousands of religious people and confiscated hundreds of schools and universities owned by Catholic and Protestant churches, as Fidel Castro declared himself an atheist Marxist. Because it must be said that above all, we are Marxist-Leninists. For many years, the regime systematically harassed and arrested religious leaders who refused to bow to the communist rule. That is what happened to Father Castor Alvarez de Vesa, a Catholic priest from Camagüey, during the 2021 protests in Cuba.
I started praying to see what I could do, and I went to where the demonstrators were, looking to accompany them. And I tried to avoid confrontation, to avoid violence, and certainly in the end, trying to avoid violence towards someone, I was hit in the head with a baseball bat.
Religious persecution in Cuba hasn't changed and continues today, as in the past. They call me a mercenary, a traitor. They tell me, you are one of those merchants that Jesus Christ expelled from the temple, and that is what we are doing. We are going to drive you out of the temple. This is what this agent was saying to me in an offensive way. Like many religious leaders in Cuba, Baptist pastor Mario Felix Leonard was forced to exile for denouncing the violations of Cubans' human rights. But other religious leaders were not as lucky as Pastor Leonard. Evangelical pastor Ramon Regal from Guantanamo was sentenced in 2017 to 3.5 years, including 1 year of hard labor, for daring to homeschool his children under Christian principles, rejecting the mandatory pro-communist education that prevails in Cuba.
Si yo quiero que mis hijos estudien de forma independiente por internet, según un programa religioso, yo no puedo porque me dicen que yo no estoy enviando a mis hijos a la escuela y entonces yo estoy cometiendo un delito por el cual puedo ser sancionado y hasta privado de la patria potestad. Eso es un gran problema que tienen los cristianos en Cuba.
Another evangelical pastor, Lorenzo Rosales Fajardo, faced a harsher sentence and still remains in prison.
This is Lorenzo Rosales Fajardo, a Protestant pastor who remains in jail, sentenced to 7 years in prison for simply participating in the historic July 11th protest a year ago today.
A poll conducted in 2022 among religious leaders in Cuba by the Madrid-based NGO Prisoners Defenders revealed that 93% experienced different types of harassment and repression. A majority, 84% of the respondents, said they have suffered threats for reasons of thought, conscience, and religion for being Christians.
In communism, they do not persecute crimes but people. To think differently has a price.
Another victim of the regime's anti-Christian crusade, Jesuit Father David Pantaleon, was expelled in 2022 for expressing criticism of the system and siding with Cubans who had come out in protest in the streets, fighting for freedom. The protests were an important moment in the growing citizen consciousness of the Cuban people, as an alternative to what the government is offering. And at that moment, tension began with all the leaders who in some way supported the free demonstration of the people about what they think. And of course, we, the church, were in the government's sight. Religious leaders in Cuba, who has come under attack, show no signs of yielding to regime pressures.
The apostolic ministries in Cuba do not link ourselves with any communist system such as the one we live in, because communism is not a political government, it is a diabolical religion.
Being killed is certainly a real risk for those who dare to be outspoken critics of the communist regime. That's what happened to 30-year-old singer Diubis Laurencio Tejeda a few years ago. A resident of a low-income neighborhood on the outskirts of Havana, he was shot in the back by the Cuban police during the 2021 protests. Christian Barrera Diaz, another 24-year-old young protester, was declared missing the day after demonstrations broke out on July 12th. The Cuban authorities told his family he was in custody, but 3 weeks later, the family was informed that he had drowned and was buried in a common grave in a cemetery in Matanzas, around 90 miles east of Havana. So far, no one has been held accountable for those deaths. Not surprisingly, Cuba has one of the worst records on human rights abuses in the hemisphere.
Today, there are still over 1,000 political prisoners on the island. This means that there are more political prisoners, prisoners of conscience in Cuba than in the rest of the Americas, all combined.
Many organizations have documented more than 80 cases of death and disappearances just in 2021. After the massive and peaceful protests in Cuba. Among them, 5 extrajudicial killings, 3 deaths in custody, and several deaths of Cubans forced into exile that died while seeking for political asylum in the region. It was not always like this. A democratic Cuba helped draft the Universal Declaration of Human Rights 75 years ago. Cuban diplomat Guy Perez Cisneros, representing the last democratic Cuban government of Carlos Prio Socarrás, alongside the delegations of Mexico and Chile, inserted language about the right to justice into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in what would become Article 8 of that declaration. Everyone has the right to an effective remedy by the competent national tribunals for acts violating the fundamental rights granted him by the Constitution or by law. Fulgencio Batista overthrew that democratic Cuba in 1952 and for 6 years presided over a military dictatorship. But hopes for a democratic restoration were dashed by the Castro brothers in 1959. 65 years later, it continues to be the biggest obstacle for a free and democratic Cuba.
La mayor víctima del régimen totalitario cubano no somos los fusilados y los mártires, es el pueblo cubano, es la sociedad cubana que la tienen en la miseria, que la tienen en la ignominia, que la tienen falta de libertad. Es la sociedad cubana, es el pueblo cubano la mayor víctima.
The shared Cuban heritage that in 1948 made world history is a legacy that the Castro dictatorship has sought to erase. However, that heritage can and must be restored in a Cuba that respects and preserves the human rights of its citizens.